All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ashley Rumschlag, and I am the CEO and president of Teresa's Fund and domesticshelters.org. I am joined today by Rachel Myers, our Senior Digital Services Specialist, and Hannah Craig, our Vice President of Content, who will be monitoring the chat and Q&A throughout the presentation. We are so excited today to be hearing from Jean Sarson and Linda McDonald. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. All right, so just a reminder, live closed captionings are available for this webinar. To enable, please click More in the menu bar and select Show Subtitles. We will also be providing a transcript within a week of the presentation. And just a reminder that all attendees are in listen-only mode. So that means that your cameras and your microphones are turned off throughout the presentation. If you do have questions, please use the Q&A box. And then if you would like to chat with other attendees or the presenters today, feel free to use the chat. And we will email the certificate, a transcript, webinar recording, additional resources, as well as the presenter slides within 1 week of the presentation. So if you're tuned in right now on Zoom, on your computer, no need to send us an email to let us know you're here. We have your email address. But if you are calling in only, so you're using your cell phone just to listen to audio today, please send us an email. And that email address is info@domesticshelters.org. I'll pull that up on screen here momentarily. Just one moment. We've got some rogue slides today. Okay, actually, I'm sorry. I'll move on and I'll show you the email address at the end. Just info@domesticshelters.org. So you see the big purple ribbon medallion on the screen. You've got it on my screen here. We've got a reminder at the top. We are in Purple Ribbon Award nomination season right now. So we are accepting nominations now through February 28th. We are shortening the nomination period this year to 2 months. So you have until the end of February. So no time to delay. Go on the site and check out which categories we have. We have a couple new ones this year. But once again, we will be awarding $30,000 in grants to our top winners. And that website address is right there, purpleribbon.awards.org, or you can find it in the DV professional section of domesticshelters.org. And then we also have another webinar coming up next Thursday with Tanya Lovelace, Full Humanity, Centering Intersectionality in All DV Services. So this is going to be a conversation of how to best serve people from all different backgrounds as a domestic violence advocate, and other roles within the domestic violence support community. So that's going to be next Thursday, the 26th, same time, same place. Rachel will drop a link in the chat so you can register for that. And we're looking forward to having Tanya as a guest. Here we go. There's that email address so you can see that. So again, my call-in listeners, I don't know why that even matters because you can't see it on the screen, but I'll read it out loud to you again, just info@domesticshelters.org. So there you go. There's the email address for our call-in listeners, and then anyone else. We love to hear from everyone. So if we're doing something right, we're doing something wrong, you just want to share a story of how we may have helped you in your quest to help victims and survivors of abuse, feel free to reach out to us. We love receiving emails from the domestic violence professional community. Okay, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit more about our presenters, just so you kind of understand their background in this topic. But today they're going to be presenting on Grassroots Science, Understanding Women Who Unsilence Intimate Partner or Domestic Non-State Torture, Trafficking, Victimization. So a lot of words there. They're going to make sense of everything and share all of their expert opinions. But Jean Sarson and Linda McDonald are feminist activists, independent researchers, scholars, human rights defenders, and supporters of women who have survived non-state torture, also just abbreviated as NST, and sexualized exploitations perpetrated within intimate relationships. They wrote a book, and in 2021, they published their first book, Women Unsilenced, Our Refusal to Let Torturer-Traffickers Win, which shares their grassroots science of theory, models, and non-state torture, victimization, traumatization, informed care, expanding this work to name non-state torturers, infliction of suicide, femicide, victimizations. Work that began in 1993 in Nova Scotia, Canada, has expanded to include the historical truth-telling of women from the US, Mexico, the UK, Western Europe, Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Papua New Guinea, plus women who identified that sellers and buyers tortured them when exploited in prostitution and pornographic victimizations. Jean and Linda, thank you so much for being here today. I know you reached out to me back in 2022. We had a fantastic conversation about your work, and I was just so impressed that I was so delighted for the opportunity to share this work with our audience of domestic violence professionals. So without further ado, feel free to turn your camera and mics on, and we'll go ahead and kind of give you the mic and a chance to share all this wonderful information. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ashley. It's great to be here. I will start by sharing my screen to show our PowerPoints, and we'll get started. This will stop others. Okay, right.
I'll just stay on here to confirm that it's up, and then I'll leave you to it.
Is that
fantastic? Looks great.
Yeah.
Looks great.
Great. So I'm Linda. The pictures, the names were kind of backwards. So I'm Linda, the one with the brown, longer hair, and Jean's the one with the shorter gray hair. And that's how you can tell us apart. And as Ashley said, we're from Nova Scotia, Canada. And our work started way back in 1993. And we just got back from speaking at the United Nations in Vienna. So we've traveled a long way from a small little community of 15,000 in Truro, Nova Scotia, to speak to members at the United Nations. And this is a bit of our journey. And we call it grassroots science because we are from the grassroots. We have no funding, we're independent. And we have been doing research all through this to show the patterns of non-state torture that we've witnessed through listening to the women. And non-state torture is really a crime that occurs in domestic violence that is often invisible because either the women don't feel safe enough to share the full extent of the torture that they've endured, or if they are sharing, often you don't recognize it if you don't understand the crime. So we're here to kind of help you understand if you're hearing things that are confusing or don't make sense to you, or if you never thought of torture happening in families and in the domestic realm. So we have 4 goals today. One is to really define what non-state torture is versus state torture, so that you'll understand the difference between the two. To introduce you to 2 women that we have supported in our work. One is Lynn and her history, and the questionnaire and our participatory research that shows the different forms of non-state torture that Lynn endured. And also Sara, the first woman that came to us in 1993. And to show her questionnaire responses as well. And also to distinguish the MO patterns of the domestic torture versus patterns of other kinds of abusers in domestic abuse. This is really a form of torture in domestic. So you'll see the different MO patterns of these intimate partner families. So start off with what is torture? Well, first we have to recognize that torture happens here too, in the home. And that's the paradigm shift that Jean and I learned because we were working with independent, with young people that were coming to us who had identified as being abused. And so that was our framework. And both of our histories come from a history of family violence. Both of our fathers were very violent. So we knew abuse. We lived it and survived it. But what we didn't know is that torture happens in families and in human trafficking. So this is the definition of non-state torture. It's torture that occurs in the domestic or private sphere, in relationships, in families, in human trafficking, in prostitution, and in pornography. And we'll kind of clarify what the difference is. So if you look at the 2 columns here, on the left is state torture, and on the right is non-state or non-state torture or NST. And the real difference between state and non-state torture is the perpetrators. In state, we all know that very well as a global reality, perpetrated by the police or the military or government staff and embassies. But what we found is really all of these acts of torture that are listed below: electric shocking, being beaten, burned, cut, whipped, immobilized by being tied or hung or caged or chained. Water tortures, when we hear about water torture, we're thinking of in the state where the person is held down and a cloth put over their mouth and then water poured on them. Whereas in water tortures in the home, the children talk about, women who were children talk about their head dunked in the toilet, in the sink, in the bathtub. So they're household tools that are used instead of what would happen in state torture. And suffocation and choking tortures, sexualized tortures such as rapes, repeated rapes, gang rapes, huge amount of raping involved, sexualized violence involved in both state or non-state. Forced drugging, it's very, very crucial in forced drugging in non-state torture as well as in state. Psychological tortures of humiliation, degradation, terrorization, horrification, animalization, and dehumanization, and forced nakedness, sleep deprivation, witnessing torture of others, and an extreme sense of powerlessness. So what we're saying is that there's a patriarchal divide between the state reality and the non-state. All those actions in the non-state sense are in families or in human trafficking or in networks of pornography or organized crime. When those happen in the criminal justice system, they're mainly still called aggravated assault or assault. But if those same actions of gang raping, sexualized tortures, electric shocking, if it's in a military base or if it's in an embassy, we call it torture, state torture. So what we're saying is that the same acts that happen to women and girls should be called torture as well. It doesn't matter where it happens. The acts are the same, so the crime is the same. And if we don't call it torture, it's a patriarchal divide or a form of discrimination against women and girls, seeing what happens to them as a lesser crime. So here's Lynn. She came to me as I was a care coordinator with home care, and she presented as a woman who had MS, and she was very angry, and she was identified as someone who was difficult to care for, and nurses really didn't want to look after her because she was so angry. So I asked her whatever happened in her life for her to become so angry. And she unfolded the story to Jean and I. This man who she met in Lake Ontario, he used to hunt on Lake Ontario for vulnerable women, or women that he could target, is a better way to put it, I guess. She was a naive young 22-year-old, and he promised her everything that she ever wanted to believe would happen in a marriage. So she ended up marrying him. And 6 months into the marriage, he said, let's go back to Ontario. They married in Nova Scotia. And then he took her back to Ontario. And as soon as she got off the plane, she was dragged into the back seat of a car and held captive in the house that this man, her husband, and 3 male partners, criminal partners, owned. And they tortured her and trafficked and prostituted her for 4.5 years. The first thing they did was a gang rape, and you hear that often in human trafficking, that the gang rape is the first action to break in or a breaking in action to really humiliate and dehumanize the woman to the point that she doesn't feel like she can fight back. And she became what they called her, a piece of meat. And they tortured her by bringing men in continuously all day long with guns and knives, and including 10 policemen who came in uniform and tortured and terrified her. She thought they were coming to save and rescue her, but they indeed were buying her, just like all the other men that came. So she did escape, and she escaped back to Nova Scotia, and she was silent for 25 years until she met me. Well, I shouldn't say when she came back, she shared what happened to her with the priest, in her community, and he socially disbelieved her, said that it was her fault, that she should go back to her husband, and that she was a bad woman, really scorned woman. So that just dehumanized her to the point that she didn't dare tell anyone else for 25 years until she met me. And shortly after, we started listening to Lynn's story, and we weren't telling her story to anyone else. It was confidential. She got a night call from a man telling her to shut up. And that shows how long the stalking lasts, because I don't know how they found out that she was sharing her story, but it didn't stop her. She kept telling, and she healed. And I was able to help with a care plan that gave her caregivers that cared about her and respected her. And she died with dignity instead of dying in a dehumanized state of silence and just complete deprivation of herself. So it was thrilling to see her grow with her sharing her own story. And she filled out we filled out the questionnaire, helping her. We have a questionnaire that really identifies 48 different acts of non-state torture, many of the ones that I showed in the patriarchal divide slide. And we break them down into different acts so that the women can complete them and see how many acts they really have endured. And Lynn had 29 all told, plus one that she added on the side. We always ask them to add the additional ones. That's the 49th one there. So Lynn added forced to self-cut with razor blades, and the torturers watched with fun and pleasure when she did that. They directed her to do it. Of course, she was forced, and they had pleasure in watching her. Really, it wasn't self-harm. It was forced self-cutting. So I don't even want to call it self-harm. But you can see all the different acts that Lynn endured, including 5 times being forcibly impregnated and 5 times forcibly aborted. And she was raped by one person and raped by groups, and near drowned in the tub, forced urine and feces smeared upon her, called derogatory names. So it was a horrible existence of 4.5 years, but she survived. Now, if we look at Sara, Sara was born into a family that was a torturer-trafficker family. And you can see the example there of the water torture, which I talked about, where they use the household objects, everyday objects that if there was ever an investigation, the police would never really think of it as a water torture tool, the sink or the tub, but that's what they were for Sara. And she was immobilized and tied down for group sexualized torture. They had a room in the basement. You see one of her drawings there. It represents the torture room in the basement in her father and mother's house, where they would go down and organize the neighbors and friends to come and gang rape her. And she used to really cope by counting the tiles on the ceilings. The reason for the drawings is often when women first start telling their stories, they can't talk about it. They've been told never to tell. And so they're terrified to tell. But if they draw, it seems to break that resistance, because they've not been told not to draw. And often they don't have the words because they're so horrified in their terror, but their hands can really draw what happens to them. And that's how we start often. And the last one on the bottom left is her being human trafficked. Her father had a little corner store in his community, and she used to be sat on the counter, the same as fruit and vegetables, next to the cash register. And they would come in lines, and her father would rent her out by the age of 2. And he would say, "Bring her back when you're done." And she still had that phrase in her, echoing in her head, "Bring her back when you're done." And one of the other ones we were talking about was the terrorization. This is sexualized terrorization, where she's threatened to be raped with a gun and guns to her head. Now, as a little child, you don't understand that gun maybe doesn't have real bullets. It doesn't matter. You're so terrified that a gun in your vagina is an ultimate terror in itself. And one of the additional comments Sara says, "I didn't know I was a person until you told me." She was so dehumanized, she didn't understand that she was human. So this happened till her late 20s when she came to us. And it took her 7 years really to heal from the torture and the trafficking. And if you look at her questionnaire, Sara had all 48, every one of those acts she endured. And those actions weren't individual, like they could all happen at the same time, a lot of them. So it was a combination of many different ordeals all at once. People have to remember that. And in her 24 years, first 24 years of life, she was raped over 24,000 times, we estimated, in all the different ordeals that she was through. So we can't say that that was abuse. That was really torture. It goes beyond abuse. And some of the other tactics that were used is she was conditioned to self-harm. And if she ever told to die by suicide, which really we don't call suicide, it's a suicidal femicide. And probably some of the women that die by suicide, it's more that they've been conditioned to die and kill themselves. So it's more of a femicide, really, a suicidal femicide than suicide. She was objectified by having marks on her body, and she had an intentional distortion of her relational view of the world. She really didn't understand the world. That was one of the main acts that we had to do, is to help her understand the reality of the world, not the distortions that her family taught her. So this was a repetitive MO for 30 years in her life. And she's highly functional now in the community. And by the way, she had a master's degree when she came to us, so she was functioning in the community and disassociating all of the torture that she was enduring. So you can't go by education, of course. These are all white Anglo-Saxon North American families that we're talking about. So if we look at the criminal informal networks, many of the families, really, that's what they are. And they have key criminal organizers. So the first one was Sara's family, and her organizers were her father, her mother, and government employees. And she was tortured and trafficked from the time she was a girl and also as a woman. And we look at the basement, the room again, to show one of the acts of that. And Lynn, her main criminal torturers and traffickers were her husband and the 3 male friends, and the police as well, because they were protection for the torturers. And one example that Lynn endured is she was group raped with a knife, and she began to hemorrhage. So she was taken to what she called a pig doctor. It was a backroom doctor, and he fixed her up, in quotations, and padded her vagina. She went back to the windowless room again. They yanked the padding out when she stopped hemorrhaging, and she was forced to start right back into the trafficking. And the third one is, her name was Elizabeth. She was another woman that we helped, and her main organizers were her father, her mother, and her uncle. And here's a drawing she did of herself when she was little, sold to strangers. There's a passing of what she thinks was money. She's not sure, but certainly there was something passing between them. And of course, she was passed off between them to perfect strangers, sold. And she's, Jean and I have supported her, and she's healed and highly functional in communities as well. But when we first met her, she was so dissociative, she could hardly function as an adult, because all the cues had been missed about what really the crime that she endured, which was torture. So you know the power and control wheel, you know that very well in the domestic work. And if you look at all the different forms of the intimidation, emotional abuse, minimizing, denying, and blaming, all of those different actions of the power and control of violence and domestic violence. What Jean and I did is we developed a non-state torture wheel. And the acts are different, and that's why the abuse is different than the torture. So there's more organized group involvement. They have really work very carefully at a cover of respectability in their community as professionals and elders and highly regarded in the community. But really what they have is they have this criminal informal network, most of them anyways. We had some that were independent and the network was more in the community, but they go from the local, the national, and even to international criminal groups, some of them. And then we broke down the different lists of different forms of non-state torture that we talked to you about in the different sections of the wheel. Like the physical was the hanging, choking, for instance, the sexualized, the gang raping, the bestiality was in the use of animals, and the use of drugs is huge because the children, if they're drugged, they get confused and can't tell the stories clearly, and then the police don't believe them or the school doesn't believe them. It also quiets them, keeps them quiet when they're being tortured. And the spiritual ritualized and use of costumes and all different psychodrama that confuses children to believe that really they're not human, but they're just humans with costumes. That's all they are. They're torturers wearing costumes to trick the children. And using use of children to exploit others and recruit, sell drugs. And of course, the economic, they take money from their children and they benefit economically as well with the trafficking. And there's a huge amount of verbal, emotional, and mental tortures that go on. So if you look at the self-assessment tools, the questionnaire really helps women tell us it really helps them clarify the forms of violence that they survived. It informs them around their women's language and clarifies their own victimization statements. And this is from one of the women that did the questionnaire. And she said how important it was to read the tortures, that it takes longer to heal. It really helped her to understand and to normalize her healing and not to blame herself and understand that she wasn't abused, she was tortured. Not that we're saying abuse is easy, because it certainly isn't, but torture, if you've ever helped anyone heal from torture, there's different techniques and it takes longer to heal from torture. But she's talked about really recovering and having a name for what happened to her was very important. It validated her life and that she's in full-time therapy for 9 years and that she was from the US, and she found it very encouraging. So here's our first poll, if you wanted to do that, Ashley.
Yes, I'm launching it right now. All right, everyone should see that right now. Some responses going on. I don't know if you want to read it out loud, but it's obviously on the screen.
Sorry, following this discussion, I think non-state torture victimizations have been dismissed as a specific form of domestic, family, or intimate partner violence committed against women and girls. Do you agree, disagree, or are you unsure? Okay, so look at that. Yeah, that's interesting that it's been dismissed as a specific form. Yeah, we agree as well. Yeah. Some are unsure and a few 1% disagree, but would say the majority really recognize that it's been a dismissed form of violence against women and girls. Thanks. All right. So I just have a few more and then Jean will take over. So I just wanted to explain to you, representing a global population of women and girls. That's what we're here to talk to you about, and how we're not just talking about Canada or United States. That's where we started. But really through back in the 90s, we were doing mostly communication through telephone and email. And then it spread to Skype. Hardly anybody Skypes now, we all Zoom, right? And then we were doing Facebook chatting and some on Twitter. And now we Zoom with women from all over the world. But we've really spread our work to the EU and to Israel, to South Africa, to Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, Australia, Indonesia. And since we've been working with our NGO in Vienna, we've had stories now from women in South America as well, which is really important because we've had support from Honduras in how important naming non-state torture is in their country, and the women that are being tortured by gangs, which is really, it's another form of non-state torture, and so is Taliban, but they're not domestic in the family sense. But non-state torture spreads beyond the domestic into the other realms of non-state torture and the social. And this is an example of one workshop that we did in Washington State. And we were working with 2 other women and then sharing our work as well. And it shows the broad expanse of the human trafficking that came from all those different stories all around the world, from families. And went to Mexico and all those states in the United States. You see all the pink lines that one woman was trafficked to all those states in the United States by her family. And the purple was trafficked to many different states in the United States as well. And the pink she was trafficked to Mexico, so that was transnational. And then with Jean and my work, one province, you see Saskatchewan, the woman was she's the one I mentioned where she was trafficked just in her local community. She was never taken out of province or out of state. But then others were taken over to other countries like Czechoslovakia in Europe. And so it's very expensive what families can do. And we need to understand that families, as you probably know, are human traffickers as well. The research is really showing that. And the numbers are getting higher and higher because we're understanding more and more as women tell us their stories, how much of the human trafficking is really originated in families. So it's growing. But, 10 years ago, most people thought that human trafficking was always a stranger. That's not the case anymore. That research has changed. So I appreciate, it's a very pervasive, as we have at the bottom, there's a pervasive criminal economy in the world, and we have to get a handle on organized crime, because even in our small province, we have the largest population of human trafficking in Canada. Nova Scotia does. And we were at a meeting today, Jean and I, and one of the women there was saying that there's more and more young people. They can hardly keep up with the referrals now of the kids coming forward. And that's because we're educating and speaking. So the more aware we become, the more knowledgeable we are, the more that young people will be able to talk earlier and get out of these organized crime networks sooner, family or not. Thank you very much.
I will take over from Linda, but I just wanted to share one point around Sara. Sara did go to what we call in Nova Scotia a transition house, which would be domestic protection housing. So she was, the staff at that house were introduced to the reality that she was running for protection from family victimization of torture and trafficking. And in Nova Scotia, because there were not many places where a person who was trafficked could go to, some of the transition houses, if they have open beds, they are taking in women and teenage girls who have been trafficked. So that might be the same thing in your communities. It may be something you want to talk about during the Q&A. So for me, I'm going to start with the grassroots science of caring. And for Linda and I, what we learned over the 30 years is the definition that we had to look at the type of care that we had to undertake to understand, because back in 1993, the whole concept of non-state torture that happened in families just did not exist. And when Sara came to us, like Linda said, she had a master's degree and she was almost 30. And when she came to us because she was stressed at work. She had no concept that the violence she was enduring had anything to do about why she wasn't coping. And it took her about 3 months to start drawing the images that Linda shared with you that she started drawing. And about 3 months, she started talking about torture. And that was our introduction. And when we went to look for support, there was none anywhere that we could find, and even globally. So as Linda showed you, the state and the non-state, we ended up researching the state torture to find out what were the patterns of violence that society or the globe were defining as acts of torture. So that's where our research started. And then we compared what Sara was telling us. And since then, it's just kind of flowed over the years that more and more women are coming and filling the questionnaire. And we have quite a few hundred questionnaires in different forms, from people who have telling us that they were trafficked using the questionnaire, and trafficking victimization, and domestic violence victimization, and pornographic victimization. And we have, I would say, about 900 to 1,000 questionnaires from people who are just saying that they know there's a difference between assault and torture by private individuals or non-state torture. So when Sara came and we could not find any support for her or for us, we decided not to abandon her. She was highly suicidal and very traumatized. We recognized that. So we decided not to just leave her because we couldn't find anybody else who would support her. So over the time, we had to decide how our care was. We informed her that we had no experience in torture recovery, but we would care as much as we could, and to do no harm. So over that time, we came to identify the type of care, and we call it victimization-traumatization informed. And the reason we do that is because we've learned that women generally, when it's just trauma informed, many women are telling us that they were not informed that they were victimized, that there was a crime committed against them. So this is like having the definition that women need to know that if they've been victimized, that somebody else, not themselves, but somebody else has inflicted a crime against them. It's not their fault. So that's why we're very important to talk about the fact that it's victimization, traumatization, informed care, because you can have trauma informed without, like just naturally, a car accident, or like you've got floods in Florida, people are traumatized without being necessarily victimized. You can be traumatized in the flood and somebody come break in your house. So then you have a victimization issue also happening. So this is the definition. And the next slide, Linda. So in the practice of victimization, traumatization, informed care, we broke it down to the naming in 3 steps. It names the type of care, the background that we had to learn and understand. It names her victimization. And what women have told us repeatedly is that when they know that there's been a crime committed against them, that it helps them stop blaming themselves, because as we know, if you're dealing with domestic violence, the perpetrators always blame their partner, that they did something wrong, and women internalize this. And the same thing with the torturers. They do the same pattern, is having the person they're torturing think it's their fault, that they deserve to be tortured. Or if we're dealing with assault or abuse, they deserve to be abused. So women tell us that as soon as they know that, it starts easing that self-blaming. So it's an important reality. And the other thing about torture healing is that globally, state torture survivors, they know that they need to tell the story. They have to be heard. And that was our experience coming with Sara. She was wanting to tell. Even though she didn't understand that it was violence, she wanted to tell. And when she started drawing her pictures, to tell, and we had to listen. And the third step, then there's a consequence. When you've been victimized, you have a consequence. You know, if your child and somebody steals your bike and you cry, you're having a trauma response. If you're being beaten by your intimate partner violence, you have a response to the battery and how you're going to survive. So that's the third step, is naming the traumatization responses. So that's the question that we had to ask ourselves. What do we expect a woman or a girl, how to act when they've been tortured? What do we expect them to act like? What do we expect their responses to be? So that was a critical question for us. And what they told us often is that they did not believe that they were disordered in any way. They felt that when they were called, they were disordered. It was like blaming them again, that there's something wrong with them. And it's critical that we listen. So that's why when we looked at taking away the D from post-traumatic stress disorder, took away the D and put post-traumatic stress responses. What is a woman's response to being tortured and trafficked? And as we know, just like in domestic violence, each woman has her unique way of surviving. So there's no pattern, if you will, of how in court a woman should act if she wants to go to court for being raped or for a domestic violence, or in this case, about torture. So it was important to us. So the next slide, please, Linda. So we made this slide for several reasons. We gave a presentation at Crimes Against Women, and Linda went to one of the workshops, and what she found out there and what we have thought about since is that one of the questions that police, if they're investigating, they often don't want to ask about sexualized victimization. That's kind of left to the side. So we wanted to show that if a woman is talking about her victimization, they may go first, because it's the easiest one to talk about probably, is the physical torture. So we've got 3 examples there about burning, cutting, and choking and strangulation. So when we were listening to women, we can ask, was the physical torture used in any way to create forms of sexualized violence? And women tell us what happened to them, because that's so dehumanizing around the sexualized victimization. So they have to know we're open to hearing and without judgment. So I've got a few examples here from physical torture, the burning. You go to the sexualized torture. Sara told us how a hot light bulb was used to insert into her vagina, even as a little girl. That may not be a tool that investigators would ever think about unless we're willing to hear what women are telling, whether they were victimized as children or as adults. Hot poker was another one, and a smothering stick inserted into her vagina. So there's a psychological response to both the physical and the sexualized, the whole idea of terror. And terror almost freezes a woman not to be able to move beyond the emotion to tell her story. So it's really important to understand the psychological consequences. And of course, there's the pain and suffering, the psychological anticipation. If they know they're in the, if you will, the hands of the torturer, they're anticipating the type of pain and suffering they're going to have, and the terror and the horror. And some women have talked about the reproductive organ damage. And we had a woman from the UK whose physician said to her, "What other animal did this to you?" Because the victimization of her perineum and her cervix and vagina was so horrific. So the only way we're going to understand women's reality is to be open to hearing what they have to tell us. The second physical torture was the cutting. And Linda's already mentioned how Lynn, they used a knife to cut her vagina. And women tell us that happened to them as children. And it was explained as getting them ready for what came next, which was the rape. And some women have said that they've had some of the tissue cut vaginally, and one woman talks about part of her nipple removed. Here again is the psychological torture consequences. They're listed there too, and mutilation is added here when there is tissue removed. And the third one is the physical torture, the choking and strangulation. Rope around their neck, they talk about that, and the issue of unconsciousness. And in listening to women's stories, what we've learned, often they'll tell us, I went into the black, and that's their childhood language coming. And we've heard it in Australia, and we've heard it in the EU, and we've heard it in Nova Scotia. And what we've come to understand, if they were children, they didn't have a word to or understanding that they were going unconscious. But as they tell their story, if you're working with children and they're telling you they're going into the black, it might be something for you to think about, that that's a childhood language for unconsciousness. And of course, the issue that we're also coming across, that if they're unconscious, it's like pseudonecrophilia, that you have an absolute powerless person that that the perpetrators are victimizing, and to understand that too. And the powerlessness, which is part of the psychological, after being raped, if they're held in captivity, like in a cage, they can't escape. That becomes part of the psychological victimization of powerlessness. And of course, the issue, the risk for a femicide, if you're into choking and strangulation, that risk is always there. And you probably know the data that if strangulation is becoming repetitive, that the chance of a femicide is 750%. So this flow chart is really that if you're trying to understand a person's victimization, is to keep in mind that what might start as a physical can end up really being an explanation also of sexualized, and of course the psychological. The next one, Linda, please. So visible captivity. And this is an image, and where I got it from is down at the bottom. And here's the horse latched onto a chair without knowing that the horse does not know. It's been conditioned just to stay, the training. And what's important about this, in our opinion, is the belief system. And this is what came with Sara. That's how we had to start understanding why Sara did not understand her victimization, because the conditioning from the time she was a little 2-year-old, like Linda showed in her drawing, that she was put on the counter and she was rented out. And often the coded word for her victimization into being trafficked was being rented out to the family. All the perpetrators, she was taught, was the family. So that was a belief system that she grew up with. And I think it's so important that we're talking openly, because society has put a belief system that often that it's women's at fault. The misogyny is pretty socially ingrained. So the more we talk, the more we're going to challenge belief systems that are dangerous to women and girls and to children. And this is one of Sara's story about trafficking in the school system. So if any of you are working with children, like she said, well, in the morning before she left home, her family gave her, her mother and father gave her a code word, and she was told not to take the bus after school, to walk. And when a car came up and said the code word, she just got in the car. That was her normal belief system. She just saw that as everyday reality. And if no one questioned her, she had no other information to consider why she did what she did. And the next one. And this is to talk more a bit about the psychological and the verbal torture. And this is Sophie, and Linda had her on the human trafficking global model from New York into Czechoslovakia. She and her mother were trafficked from New York into Czechoslovakia. So Sophie was the youngest person that came to us. She was 17 from New York. And she came because every time she tried to tell, she was told she was lying, and they sent her back to her family. And it was her uncle and an aunt who were her torturers and traffickers of her and her mother. They had control of her mother. So Sophie shared her psychological thinking of her relationship with herself. In the end, she considered herself nothing. And the women tell us what they were called. Like on the questionnaire, it says treated as non-human, and this is all the language that puts them down. So this is important for them to understand that the words that they may be hearing in their head coming are post-traumatic stress sensory flashback of the perpetrator's language. So our question was then, whose language are you hearing in your head? Is it their language or your language? And the next slide, Linda, please. And the reason I'm saying this next slide is that in order to differentiate the perpetrator's language in their head and to help women to develop their own voice, we created this journaling sheet. We wrote down on one side of the column their voices, the perpetrator's voices, what they did. And this is psychological crime, emotional crime. So this is an example of Sophie. And then to ask them if they can think even of one word to start thinking of their own voice. We can even do it for ourselves when we have a dilemma, you know, what is my opinion? So in this case, it's a takeoff of that. And that's how we started, and we keep building their resilience. Every time they can think of their own words, of their own self relationship with themselves, how important this is to themselves and for themselves, just keep building on their voices so they can differentiate themselves from their, in this case, torturers. Now, the other intervention we had to get into, and this was started with Sara, was role-playing, because she kept saying to us, why is it that I go to school and I have bruises on my head and the teachers aren't asking what happened to me? So we said to Sara, well, what do you say if the teachers were going to ask? And she said, I tell them I ran into the baseball bat. So we're thinking, well, that made sense, but we knew her background did not seem to fit with the what she was saying. So we asked her to role play, and what we discovered is that there were men that gathered, and they made a column on one side and a column on another, and a man at the top, at the front of the columns, stood with a bat, and then they laughed at her and forced her as a little girl to run into the bat. So she was telling the truth, but in her perspective, she wasn't seeing this as violence, but this is how we came to understand what she meant. And we could explain why the teachers probably did not understand when she said if they had asked that she ran into the bat. So it's starting to create her voice too, about understanding what crimes were being committed against her. And challenging beliefs, that was one way of doing it, and adding her voice different than the torturers was another, or if it was assaulters, it would be the same thing. And the headbanging, Sara had about 3 episodes in the healing over the 3 years of serious headbanging, that we had to try to unfold why she was reenacting headbanging. And what eventually was disclosed is when she was 2 years old, her father told her to bang her head, that the bruises made her pretty. But what we discovered over these 30 years, that other perpetrators also, other torturers also use this technique, not necessarily of headbanging, but it's a technique that redirects their physical and sexualized torture pain to another form of a victimization, if you will, because being conditioned to bang your head is another form of victimization. And that's what Sara learned. And during the hard sessions, sometimes she got triggered into the head banging. But other women have told us that their mother or their grandmother would hold them and talk soothingly to them and ask them to look at a special doll or a special toy, another way of distracting themselves. So it's a technique that perpetrators can use, and we only know about this by listening to the women. Then next slide, Linda.
Jean, I just want to interject here. We've got a little bit less than 3 minutes left, so I want to give you guys an opportunity to kind of end on your terms and end in a way that you'd like, but also want to offer up the ability, if you have the time, to continue on. So it's really up to you how you want to proceed.
Okay. We have 3 minutes left?
Yes, yeah, we allowed about 60 minutes today.
Okay, so why don't we go to the next poll?
Perfect. All right, I'm launching that now.
And what this poll was about is, do you think education about non-state torture will reduce the social isolation and rejection women can experience when they disclose they were non-state tortured and exploited within family or intimate partner relationships with connections to like-minded informal networks? Maybe, no, or yes.
Okay, let's get to 50% here. We are good there. I'll go ahead and close that out and share the results.
Maybe, yes.
Maybe is 26%, and no is 7%, and yes is 67%. And actually, I can share with you that we've asked, we did questionnaires or little research questionnaires, and that's what women have told us too, and men who were victimized, that they think yes. So Linda, if you want to go to slide 28 very quickly, I'll just share about the issue of social inclusion. So what we've been talking about is that the women are telling us about torture, terror, and horror. And if the system is only hearing assault or abuse, then they're not really hearing the women. And Elizabeth, this is how she explains it. She says that she speaks about torture, and sometimes she feels so isolated, like being in a place that no one talks her language. And I have to keep relating to their language, even though it is not my language. It's a social isolation of different, difficult to describe. And that was her drawing. That those are all the torture images that she had, that she was walking around with, trying to say something and was not being understood. And the next slide, Linda, I'll stop right there at the next slide. So this is what the women are telling us, that if they're telling you that they were tortured, she asking that torture is the word that's used, not abuse or assault. They want women who meet them to know that they're not crazy. And they're saying, if you have trouble saying the word torture, please practice it. Hear them, acknowledge what they're saying. And even if you can just say, I know now about non-state torture, I believe you and I'm sorry, that's healing for them. And to know that they have survival responses, and sometimes these survival responses get in the way. And they're learning they have human rights, that there was a crime committed against them, and that she felt they feel socially like a freak for so long. They just want to fit and know it's okay and they will be accepted. And this is one of the women's drawing that we help Alex from, actually she's from the States, just to know that she's here. So we'll end there.
Wow, so much fantastic information. Linda, anything to end on as well before we sign off?
I think the three things that we tell people, they're worried, what can I do if I meet someone who says they were tortured, is to tell them that you care about them, that you're sorry, and that you believe them. I think those are the three statements that most women say are very validating. So it's simple to say, but it's very, very complex to them because they've never had anyone ever say that to them before.
Yeah. And Jean, any closing words from you?
I just saw one of the questions. They wanted to know how Lynn died, and to respect Lynn, she died of MS. Just so that you know that she didn't die of the violence, like Linda said, she died in peace, knowing she was heard. And I think that's what Linda's statement says, you know, when you say to a woman who's trying to explain she was tortured and you say you're sorry and you hear her, I think that builds resilience and a measure of peace.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you, ladies, so much valuable information, and we're getting a lot of great feedback in the chat already. And just a reminder to everyone that this has been recorded. So we'll send over the recording, slides, transcripts, certificate of attendance, and any shared resources. We'll share those with everyone who's logged in within 1 week. If you're a call-in listener, please email us at info@domesticshelters.org to let us know where we should send these materials. And just a little extra note today as we end today's presentation. Obviously, this is a very, very tough topic. I know we work in domestic violence, which is never easy either, but obviously some very, hard stories were shared today. So please take a moment to, however you practice self-care, please do so, because I know that, we need to process this information in a way that allows us to, fill up our bucket so we can help others. But with that, we will go ahead and end today's presentation. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.